Hello, and welcome to episode 68 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. I'm Leah Heigl, and I'm here with my co-host Aidan Muir, and today we are talking about testosterone. So, quite an interesting one. Aidan knows about it a lot more than I do, but honestly, looking over the research in the last kind of couple of weeks kind of shows me that there's not a lot to know. So we will go over it in all the detail we can. So testosterone is a form of ecdysteroid, which is a plant and insect equivalent of hormones like testosterone. So being that it's somewhat similar to testosterone, I guess you can kind of see why people have gravitated towards this when thinking about things like muscle building. So where did its hype actually come from? So it was mentioned on the Joe Rogan podcast, and that being such a popular podcast and obviously great source of information for young men. No, I'm not going to riff on it. But that's where it was mentioned. Obviously, Joe Rogan's huge. And he was on, so it wasn't his podcast, it was Andrew Huberman's, but both huge podcasts.
I think it was on Joe Rogan's podcast, but
well.
Andrew Huberman was a guest who was talking about it.
Got you. And Huberman said that it basically acts the same way as DECA or another testosterone derivative. It increases testosterone performance and recovery by an equivalent amount. Big call. And there was also this other guy that Aidan talked about to me that has apparently sells testosterone and also is like a really big advocate for it. Derek from More Plates, More Dates. And he seems to be kind of, one of the biggest promoters of testosterone at the moment. So quite a few people talking about it, big people with big podcasts. So you can kind of see where it's got its hype from.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess one of the, jumping into, why does it have this hype? I think people are attracted to the fact that it is not testosterone. It's not it's a legal way to potentially build more muscle and with steroid-like results in quotation marks, because no one can see that on the podcast. That's theoretically what people want it to be. So going through the Derek More Plates, More Dates kind of thing, he did a video response to the Joe Rogan clip from Andrew Huberman because, as I said, it was getting a lot of hype from that. And Derek had already been talking about it for at least 1 or 2 years leading up to that. So he was already considered to be an authority on the kind of topic. So he's making a video in response to that, just responding to some claims. I'd previously watched that video a year ago or so because I had a few clients who were looking at testosterone and other ecdysteroids. And I was I'm just going to rewatch that in the lead up to this podcast just to get another summary of it again. And firstly, he addressed the claim that it's taking anabolic steroids that Andrew Huberman made. He talked about being like DECA, and Derek pointed out only one study exists comparing it to steroids, and it was comparing it to Dianabol, not DECA, and it was in a rodent model, both of which were not really talked about by Huberman, which is the pretty important details. And it actually outperformed Dianabol in that study, which is wild because D-bol is well known to lead to some pretty crazy gains, and yeah, that's just it's an interesting thing that obviously adds hype to it. But I went and looked for that study myself, and from what I could see, it wasn't actually testosterone. It was ecdysteroids. Testosterone is a form of ecdysteroids. We're kind of talking about testosterone because that's the most popular form of it, but there's not that much research at all on testosterone. There's no human research whatsoever, and there's minimal research just on ecdysteroids in general. But as I said, I tried looking for it, but maybe I just found a different study. I don't actually know. I can't confirm it was exactly the same study, but that's what I found. Other points Derek pointed out, it doesn't increase testosterone, which once again, that was quite literally a quote from Andrew Huberman. He says it increases testosterone. So it doesn't increase testosterone, but that's a positive and a minus, or not a, it's interesting because it's that's a positive in that, although it doesn't increase testosterone, people who are taking this also do not want side effects, right? Mm-hmm. And anything that artificially or whatever you'd want to say increases our testosterone also means when you stop taking it, our body's no longer naturally producing it at the same level. Derek has had a lot of people do blood work while on it and showed no change in testosterone, which also means it doesn't suppress production either. But that's the interesting thing. He's highlighted all of these things, saying it was never compared to DECA, doubling down on it being a single rodent study, all of these kind of things. it makes him seem more trustworthy. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but it's a really interesting tactic. Do you know Gary Vaynerchuk? I've probably talked about him a little bit.
Yep.
Yeah, so Gary Vaynerchuk is like a business guy. I used to be a little fanboy of him, but I haven't seen much of his content recently. But he tells a story about when he started Wine Library TV, which is he had a wine business that he was taking over from his father, and he was one of the first YouTubers ever talking about wine. And he said he got on there he was basically just going to advertise for his company, right? Mm-hmm. And the plan was to like review wines, but make them all seem really good so people would buy from him. But then he's like, I turned on the mics and I was like, or the cameras, and he's like, it just clicked for me. Being authentic is going to work.
Makes you trustworthy.
It makes you trustworthy. If I have a bad wine that is something that we sell and I say that it's bad, people are going to listen to me when I say something good about another one, and they're more likely to buy. And I think that's really interesting. I've heard Amazon, that was one of their thought processes with reviews. They let people leave bad reviews on products that they sell so that you trust the good reviews more. Interesting idea.
It's a good tactic.
Yeah. And as we mentioned, Derek sells Turkesterone. Mm-hmm. And so he can say all of these things, but then he shows anecdotal results. And he's like, this person took Turkesterone for 6 weeks and they got really good results. And suddenly it's like, oh, well, he is quite trustworthy because of him saying that. He also says with these anecdotal results that there are non-responders as well, which is a red flag, obviously, because there's not many non-responders to D-bol.
You just don't not respond to it.
But it's an interesting thing. So like going through all of those things, that's like really how it's gained hype, because it's legal, doesn't have any side effects that people are aware of, and there seems to be that kind of potential that people are talking about.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest kind of red flags would be that there's just no human research on it. So like prior to 2006, there wasn't even any human research on ecdie steroids in general. It was all like rodent animal models prior to then. So in 2006, though, a guy named Bill Campbell put a team together, and it was a study of 45 lifters, and one group took a form of ecdie steroids, again, not turkesterone, but a form of ecdie steroids, and after 8 weeks of supplementation, there was just no improvement in muscle or strength versus the placebo, and no change in testosterone either. So we do kind of have this one study showing nothing in regards to ecdie steroids, and again, not turkesterone specifically. And in 2018, the ISSN released a position statement on supplements where they concluded that ecdie steroids don't really do anything for muscle strength or performance. So that's kind of the overall position at the moment, kind of where I guess evidence-based people stand on things like turkesterone and ecdie steroids. But there was one big outlier study, and I am going to let Aiden go over this because he knows it a lot more than I do, but it showed some pretty crazy results for ecdie steroids. Yeah,
so before that Bill Campbell study from 2006, like obviously no major results or anything like that. I found it really interesting when I first saw that one, because it's like Bill Campbell's got a great reputation for doing legitimate research and everything like that. So I was like, oh, it's cool to see somebody like literally just ask the question, does this work? Let's put it together a study. Let's see what happens. Mm-hmm. And then there was no real studies like that until 2019, which is this outlier study. It's the most recent study to the best of my knowledge as well. And they got insanely good results, which is part of why it seems to have really gained hype since 2019. This study had 46 men with around 1 year's experience in the gym, and they took a supplement that was labeled to contain 100 milligrams of ecdysterone, once again, not turkesterone, and they took it for 10 weeks. And they made way better muscle gains than placebo. Fun fact, the placebo group lost muscle during that time, which is always a red flag, because it's like, what were they doing with this training protocol for 10 weeks? It's kind of weird. But the most weird aspect of this study, well, firstly, was that the gains they made were, people have done like comparisons and been like, this is better than certain studies where people have taken steroids for 10 weeks. Like they made really good gains. And the most weird thing was that when the supplement was measured later, and they included this in the study, they mentioned this, it only contained 6 milligrams of ecdysterone, which is 6% of what is labeled. So it's like they thought they were having 100 milligrams, or they thought they were providing 100 milligrams because they assumed that was like the perfect dosage or whatever, which is another thing we'll talk about in a second, but what should be the perfect dosage. But they only took 6% of what they actually meant to have, and they made incredible gains. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a weird one.
Yeah, and like the findings just don't add up. And like, I don't know, like speculating on what it could mean, I'm going to jump to the obvious, like, was there steroids in that supplement? Like, if only 6% of this was ecdysterone or 6% of what was labelled, what if like a large chunk was Anavar or T-Vol or another like actual
like
steroid?
if you can go that wrong, like that's not just a mild difference between what they thought they were giving and what they were giving. It's quite big. So like what else?
Yeah.
Like it obviously wasn't a regulated substance.
So like I'm not like chucking accusations out there, of course, but I'm like, no, it's a possibility. And then beyond that though, like they had quite small sample sizes. So even though it was 46 men, it was split up into 4 groups and there was only about 10 people in each group. And when you look at it from that perspective, genetics play a massive role in this. Like I think about this a lot with a lot of the studies that we like make strong conclusions from. What if some people just gained muscle more easily than others? Like if you chucked me in a study with like a genetic freak and we did the same training protocol, but a slightly different nutritional protocol, the genetic freak would make way better muscle gains than me. And people could read that and be like, oh, that was the nutrition protocol that caused that. And there is also a possibility that in this study, there was a bunch of genetic freaks in one and then a bunch of like people who just are prone to losing muscle in the other study.
It was such a small study. It's definitely something that could happen just by accident.
Yeah, so many things. So what are our thoughts on
I think my thoughts were a little clear throughout the podcast.
Yeah, so I think you've given a nice summary. I'll give some of my thoughts.
Great.
Firstly, it is expensive. I'm not going to name the supplement store, but there is a supplement store in Australia that this was just a quick Google. I'm like, where's the quickest place I can find turkesterone and see the price? 60 tablets was sold for $89. So that's more than $1 per tablet or more than $1 per serve. There's a lot of cheaper supplements than that, particularly when factoring in whether something is working or not. I am of the opinion it likely does nothing, but we are both, I hope, of the opinion that if research comes out in large scale showing that it works, we will change our mind.
Yeah. Always open to hearing new research. And look, if it turns out that like that study wasn't an outlier, I'd be on this tomorrow.
Same thing.
But yeah, at this point, not so much.
And the other question that I asked this of a lot of things as well, like it was even something I consider with ashwagandha, which we talked about in a previous podcast, but it's like, how do we know what the right dosage is?
Yeah.
Like the way to figure out the right dosage of something beyond obviously mechanisms and everything like that is to do a lot of large scale research and see what dosage works best. And when I talk about ashwagandha one, it's like, there's a lot of things of ashwagandha that we're kind of questionable, being like, does it help with this? Like, we're not even sure it helps. If we're not even sure that it helps, and how do we know what dosage is the optimal dosage? That question is much larger for ecdysteroids and turkesterone because, well, firstly, turkesterone, there's been nothing done. How do we know what the correct or the best dosage is beyond anecdotal kind of what people say works for them? And there's always reason to be skeptical of that. And then the ecdysteroids one where it's like, well, if 6% of what is labelled, if that happened to be a repeatable thing and that worked really, really well, why did they choose 100 in the first place? Why did they, like, how do we know why they chose certain dosages to start off with? We've kind of got to find stuff that's working first and then make a lot of studies to find out the right dosage. Yeah,
and on top of that, in terms of cons would be if you do compete in like a tested sport, it is something I'd probably just stay away from because it's obviously not regulated, particularly at this point. So as a con, even if you're like considering it, like if you're in a tested sport, maybe don't go down that route.
Yeah, I don't really have an opinion on that. I'm sure WADA's got it. Like, I don't know if it's on the watch. I haven't looked at that. So, but like, if it was on,
I think it's just so new and unregulated that I'd be mindful.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, this has been episode 68 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. If you haven't left a rating and review, that would be super greatly appreciated if you could. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in.